Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Lin, and I will be your moderator for the session, China and the Mitigation of Existential Risks. I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker, Jenny Xiao. Jenny is a PhD student in political science at Columbia University, specializing in international relations. Her main research interests include China's foreign relations, emerging technologies, and political psychology. Prior to Columbia, Jenny received a BA with first-class honors from the University of Hong Kong, where she studied political science, American studies, and European studies. She was also a summer research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, a mentor at the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative Fellowship this past summer, and a Tianxia fellow at the Tianxia Academy in Beijing, China. Today, Jenny will explore the question, why does China matter for existential risks? She'll offer an overview of China's role in mitigating a range of these risks, including those from advanced AI, nuclear weapons, biosecurity, climate change, and great power conflicts. One last comment before we get started. On the right side panel swap card, feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave an upvote questions for Jenny to answer at the end of the session. Jenny will also be hanging out with us on GatherTown for a bit after the presentation. Without further ado, welcome Jenny.
Sure, yeah, thanks Ashley for the wonderful presentation. And I'm really excited to be here today to present on China and the mitigation of existential risks. So before I dive into the presentation, I want you guys to think about one very important question, which is, here it is. Why does China matter for existential risks? And I think the answer is kind of obvious, which is, the short answer is that great power politics is back. And we can see this from the recent Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I'm sure you guys have been paying a lot of attention to the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And here I want to flag the role that China plays in this crisis. So this is probably the most significant geopolitical event since the end of the Cold War. And I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to China's attitudes, but China currently remains on the fence. A couple of days ago, speakers from the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a 5-point declaration on China's position in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And basically, China, on the one hand, wants all sides to lay down arms and negotiate. It also says that it believes in Ukraine's sovereignty, but on the other hand, it's blaming the West for expanding NATO and threatening Russia. So sort of China's taking this position, which is on the fence. But China will matter a lot for the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So on the one, very importantly, China will matter for the effectiveness of sanctions. So even if the West was to impose sanctions on Russia, if China, helps Russia get around these sanctions, the effectiveness of Western sanctions will be greatly undermined, which was the case in 2014 when Russia engaged in a conflict with Ukraine over Crimea. And in a worst case scenario, there might be a great power war involving the US and China. Some pessimists predict that the Russian-Ukraine crisis might spread and become a great power war. There has been some concern that China might use the Russia-Ukraine crisis as an opportunity to expand its influence over the South China Sea or, launch a war over Taiwan. I think mainstream political analysts think the likelihood is pretty low. But in the case of a great power war, a lot of things can happen, and I don't want to make any absolute predictions. I'm just trying to say here that China really is a big player in the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and next time that you read news about the war, pay attention to China's attitudes because it will matter for the outcome of this conflict. Okay, so now I want to give an overview of the role that China plays in the mitigation of great power conflict and how Western scholars have viewed China's rise in the last 20 years, and also what are the predictions for what will happen in Sino-Western relations going forward. So one very dominant perspective is the liberal perspective, which was very, very popular in the early 2000s when China first joined the WTO. And at the time, there's a lot of optimism that China will be fully integrated into a Western-centric liberal international order. because this order is open, it's integrated, it's rule-based, and it's like it attracts countries to join, and it's very, very hard to break free from. And also liberals argue that because of the nuclear revolution, essentially like the invention of nuclear weapons, makes the outbreak of war between great powers very unlikely, and this will be sort of like a basis for peace between China and the West. As you guys probably noticed from reading the news, this perspective has become less and less popular over the last 5 to 10 years. And in its place, the realist perspective has gained a lot of momentum. One of my professors at U Chicago, called John Mearsheimer, is a big proponent of the realist perspective. So he argues that China will try to dominate Asia just the way that the US dominates the Western Hemisphere. And he predicts that there will be an intense security competition with considerable potential for war between China and the US. Mearsheimer is also, he's also the person who predicted a crisis over Ukraine like 20 years ago, because he argues that, you know, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe will provoke Russian fears and like later become like a landmine for war, essentially. Another interesting scholar, the Harvard professor Graham Allison, argues that there will likely be a Thucydides trap between the US and China. So the Thucydides trap basically refers to the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta, and how this dynamics between rising and falling powers create incentives for war. And a lot of Chinese commentators and American commentators alike have been very worried about the prospect of a potential Thucydides trap between the US and China. Okay, so moving beyond China and great power war, I want to talk about China and like specific issue areas and existential risks. First, China is like a big player in artificial intelligence. In 2017, the Chinese State Council released the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, which lays out China's ambitions for its AI development in different milestones. So for example, by 2020, China aims to reach globally advanced levels in AI development by 2020. And then by 2025, China intends to build a core AI industry worth 400 billion RMB and achieve major research breakthroughs. And by 2030, China wants to become the world's leading AI power. And of course, this document instilled a lot of fear in the US government. So like on the bottom right over here is a report by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And this commission was established by the US government in 2018, 1 year after China issued its New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. And if we take a look at the headlines on the left and, you know, up here, there's a lot of concern about an arms race between the US and China because of China's stated AI ambitions and because of Washington's response to China's AI development. Naturally, there's been a lot of research on China's AI capacities. Jeff Ding, for example, wrote a paper at the Governance of AI Institute at Oxford, estimating China's AI capacity. This paper is slightly dated, but I think some of the parameters are still like very relevant and interesting. And here on the bottom right is a prediction of China and the US's share of the top 1% of AI papers. And we can see here that the projection is that by approximately 2025, China will overtake the US in its share of top 1% of AI papers. So China is like making a lot of progress in its AI development, and it's taking less and less time for China to achieve the state of the art or catch up with like leading AI labs. Now I kind of want to talk about China and Biorisks. I know this is like a very, very timely topic and very fresh on our minds because of the COVID outbreak. In 2002 to 2004, there was a SARS outbreak, which was first identified in Foshan, Guangdong in November 2002. The Chinese government, sort of like its response during the COVID outbreak, it initially restricted information flows. So the WHO was not notified until February 2003. And we essentially see the same pattern in 2019 during the initial phases of the COVID outbreak. So the first case was detected in Wuhan on December 8, 2019, but information about the outbreak was censored until January 20th, 2020. And Wuhan was placed under quarantine 3 days after the information, was released. But subsequently, China imposed very tough measures to control the virus. So, I mean, nowadays it's very hard for any foreigner to get into China. And if you want to go to China as a Chinese national, you'll be quarantined for 56 days in some cities. So essentially, like China is like taking the zero COVID policy, and it imposes like very, very tough COVID control measures. And oops. I don't know why my slides are like jumping back and forth. There must be a technical issue. But anyways, all right. So I want to explain a little bit about China's crisis response patterns. So why China like exhibits initial inertia and subsequent overreaction to biorisks. So the Stanford sociologist Zhou Xueguang argues that China's delayed information flow in the initial phases of these crises is due to its top-down governance structure. Local officials basically lack autonomy and tend to shun responsibility. They have no incentive to take on responsibility, but they have a lot of great incentive to prioritize political stability. And also because China relies very heavily on performance legitimacy, this creates a strong incentive for officials to prioritize political stability over information flows and transparency. But once the information reaches the top, the central government is able to coordinate provincial policy relatively effectively because of its top-down governance structure. So in a sense, China's top-down governance structure creates both pros and cons for dealing with biosecurity outbreaks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and SARS. Okay, I want to spend a couple minutes talking about China's role in the mitigation of climate change. So I don't know if you guys are aware, but China became the world's largest carbon emitter in 2004. But fortunately, in September 2020, China pledged to go carbon neutral by 2060 and aim to reach emissions peak before 2030. Some, international NGOs, such as the Climate Action Tracker, rates China's climate action as highly insufficient. But most developed countries and most countries on these NGOs' radars are not making a sufficient contribution to the mitigation of climate change. I just want to point out here that China's contribution to the mitigation of climate change is very crucial for the success of any climate regime, and previous climate regimes that have not managed to get China fully on board have failed to achieve their main objectives. And I think having China on board and having China take its fair share of responsibility in mitigating climate change is very crucial for dealing with this issue area. And I want to spend, I think this is the final issue, and I want to spend a couple minutes talking about China's role in nuclear security, and what role it can play in the mitigation of nuclear risks. So compared with other countries such as the US and Russia, China has a relatively modest nuclear arsenal. So if you look at the graph on the right over here, Russia and the US have many, many, many more nuclear warheads than China. According to current estimates, China has somewhere between 200 to 400 nuclear warheads, and it maintains a no first use policy since its first nuclear explosion in 1964, which means China basically says, if I'm not attacked by nuclear weapons first, I'm not going to use nuclear weapons against attacker. But in 2021, a US Pentagon report estimates that China plans to build 1,000 warheads by 2030. I looked into the report and I think the evidence is kind of sketchy. So they quote some retired Chinese generals. They also use China's increased nuclear enrichment as evidence that China wants to build more warheads. The only thing I want to say here is that yes, China is modernizing its nuclear arsenal, but I think the Pentagon's predictions are not based on solid facts. And I encourage you guys to go into the report and look at the evidence that the Pentagon uses to estimate China's nuclear warhead production. Aside from China's own nuclear warheads, China is important for the governance of nuclear weapons because, like, historically, China has played a role in the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, for example, China played a role in assisting Pakistan's nuclear program, and it also currently plays a very important role in deterring North Korea. If you look into the 2017 North Korea-US crisis, so there was a likely crisis between North Korea and the US in the summer of 2017. China played a very important role in deterring North Korea and stopping it from like escalating the crisis. And I think going forward, China will still play a very large role in deterring North Korean nuclear actions against South Korea or against US allies. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I want to end with a quote from the very famous Chinese author, Lu Xun. And the quote says, "The infinite distance and countless people are all related to me." And I think Lu Xun is like one of the great Chinese thinkers who have been thinking very deeply about the issue of long-termism and humanity's long-term future. And here I kind of like want everyone to think about the role that different civilizations play and the responsibilities that people from different parts of the world have in the mitigation of existential risks. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you guys for your attention, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Oh, thank you so much for that presentation, Jenny. To start us off, you've established that China has an important role to play in addressing a number of X risks, such as AI and bio and global power conflict. Is there a call to action here? Like, what can listeners who want to contribute to kind of like the China X risk intersection do?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's also a very difficult question because unless you pursue a research career in, in Sino-Western coordination or on specific issue areas, it's very hard for you to like contribute to these areas directly. I think if you are someone who wants to do research on existential risk mitigation, pay closer attention to China's actions and definitely like try to understand China's policies in that issue area better. Because something that I notice when I'm doing research on existential risk is that usually the perspective is very, very Western centric. So they'll talk about like climate actions in the US and the UK, across Western Europe, but like oftentimes less attention has been paid to actors such as China, and like China is like growing, it's becoming increasingly important in a lot of these issue areas. So if you do want to do research in the China Express space, definitely pay attention to China. And also if you're considering donating to effective charities, consider donating to ones that do research on the long-term future and also like on China-related issues.
Great, thank you, Jenny. There are a couple questions from the audience, one of which is, if you could, would you change how China is presented or maybe present new narratives of China's perspective that are different from those that exist in EA or other circles or Western circles?
Right. So I don't think there is like an established narrative in EA about China's role. I think one of the main reasons is that effective altruists tend to have a very like rationalist viewpoint on China and like other world powers. Effective altruists tend to think about, the role of China as they tend to think that China like plays an important role in the mitigation in a lot of these issues, but on the other hand, they're consuming a large chunk of their role from traditional Western media. I don't have like a very I would not say that I want to change the entire narrative around China, but I'm just trying to say that if we want to collaborate with China more effectively in dealing with a lot of these express issues, it's a better idea to tone down on certain criticisms of China in like certain critical periods, and also like try to advance a narrative of there being room for collaboration and not just like you're either with us or against us. Because China, no matter what it does in other areas, it's going to play a very important role in the mitigation of existential risks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would you increase the amount of EA community building in China, or is the current state of these activities adequate, or like the most practical that can be achieved and relevant in some way?
Right, yeah. So I've been quite active in the EA community in China. I think the community is growing, but we don't have enough like local members. So most of the EA members in China are like Western educated, or they became familiar with EA ideas through other channels, especially like studying abroad. And we're actively trying to cultivate like local talents and like trying to recruit talents from top universities in China. And I think that's like a next step for the EA community there.
Awesome. And would you be able to speak to a bit as to how the mitigation of X risks is different in China versus the Western world, if it is different in some way?
Right. I don't think there are like huge differences between China's and like the West mitigation of existential risk. I feel like the most of the policies are the same. Most of the technologies are the same. I think the biggest difference is the role of intellectuals or researchers in the mitigation of existential risk. I think in the West, a lot of these initiatives are like initiated by researchers and the so-called like epistemic community in the West. Whereas in China, like individual researchers and experts play a much smaller role in initiating these projects. So usually what happens is that the Chinese government, they try to recruit experts to serve on certain government boards, to advise the government on certain existential risk issues, even though it's not called existential risk. The government is concerned about things like AI risks or climate change or biosecurity. The government will actively recruit experts to work on these issues. So a student of mine is currently writing a paper on the role of China's epistemic community or experts in the mitigation of existential risks.
Awesome. Great. And another question from the audience is, are there enough safeguards in the Chinese government structure to prevent a bad leader from unilaterally triggering an existential crisis?
I think that's a very, very abstract question. I think the most likely scenario in which like a leader could trigger an existential risk is by starting a war, which we've seen like in the Ukraine-Russia conflict right now, right? If you have like one leader and he has the power to start a war, that would be very, very hard. That would be like a very big existential risk, especially if it's a war against another nuclear power. I don't think there are many safeguards against that because unfortunately, like after Xi came into power, he concentrated a lot of power on his own hands. So it's very hard for like other decision makers to stop him from like making crucial decisions. But on the other hand, I am aware that like Chinese leaders tend to be a lot more prudent than like leaders from other authoritarian regimes, because China still relies a lot on economic development and performance legitimacy. And in order to maintain economic development, it can't just randomly start wars over islands in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. We are running up on time here. So I guess one last question is, you've spent a lot of time in China, both growing up there and going to university in Hong Kong. How has this shaped your work? How has this shaped your understanding of the China X risk field?
Yeah, I think spending a lot of years in China and also like growing up there really made me understand the Chinese perspective a lot more than someone who didn't have that kind of experience. I think on the one hand, you understand what's on the leaders' minds, you understand the Chinese perspective. On the other hand, you sort of like grow up with a Sinocentric perspective, which I mitigated through like studying for many, many years in the West. Whereas people from the West tend to have like a very strong Western-centric perspective. So when they think about existential risk, they naturally tend to think about, oh, like what is the US doing? What is Western Europe doing? Whereas people in China naturally tend to think in terms of like in a very much more Sinocentric perspective, like China's role in climate change, China's role in mitigating nuclear risk or in AI development, that sort of stuff.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. yeah, that's all the time we have for this session. But thank you, Jenny, for just being here and for sharing your time with us today. For all conference attendees, Jenny is going to be extending the Q&A on GatherTown. So if you're interested in that, feel free to join us in Gather, and you'll be able to find Jenny in the participant menu and press follow to locate her.